The heretic's fork. A simple but highly painful device, the heretic's fork was a metal rod with sharp spikes on both ends. One end was placed under the chin, and the other against the chest or neck, preventing any movement. Victims were forced to remain completely still. Any movement drove the spikes deeper into their flesh. If they tried to sleep or relax, the spikes stabbed their throat, causing constant agony. It was often used on heretics or accused witches during the Spanish Inquisition to force confessions. The rack. One of the most famous medieval torture devices, the rack was a large wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's hands and feet were tied with ropes, and the executioner would turn the rollers to slowly stretch the body. With each turn, joints dislocated, muscles tore, and bones eventually snapped. Victims often confessed to anything just to end the suffering. If they weren't executed afterward, they were left crippled for life. Just imagine the feeling of hearing your own bones slowly crack. That must have sting. The torture chair, also called the iron chair. The iron chair was covered in hundreds of sharp metal spikes. The victim was forced to sit, and their body weight pressed them onto the spikes, piercing their skin. To make the torture worse, ropes or chains tightened around their limbs, forcing them deeper into the spikes. Sometimes, hot coals were placed underneath the chair, heating the metal and burning the victim alive. You know, humans really got creative just for torture. The knee splitter. As the name suggests, the victims should probably say goodbye to their legs, because the victim's knee was placed on a vice-like device between two spiked metal plates which were slowly screwed together, shattering the kneecap and tearing the flesh. This was often used in the Spanish Inquisition and medieval Europe, and for some reason, people thought this wasn't painful enough, and they used it alongside other methods like the rack or thumb screws to extract confessions. Damn, that's just crazy. Coffin torture. This was arguably one of the worst torture methods people had to go through psychologically, and it involved locking the victim inside a metal or wooden cage, sometimes with spikes. Victims were left to die from starvation, dehydration, or exposure. I can't imagine the amount of slow pain that would inflict. Some were hung in public squares where birds and rats fed on them. Thumb screws. This one was used across Europe and Asia, and it's done with a painful device to extract confessions and information. The victim's fingers, toes, or even ears were placed between two metal plates with spikes. The executioner would then tighten a screw, slowly crushing bones and tearing skin. Did people even last 5 seconds with this? Because I'll be speaking the truth without me even knowing it. And oh, I just heard some versions were heated just to add more spice to it. Stuff like this could make a person go insane. Whatever it is you're hiding can't be worth it. Crocodile shears. The crocodile shears were metal pincers designed to tear flesh and crush bones, and was used primarily in medieval Europe. It was heated red hot before being used to grip the victim's fingers, genitals, or tongue. The executioner would then pull or twist, causing the flesh to be ripped apart, causing extreme blood loss and tissue damage. In some cases, it was used to castrate traitors or criminals, ensuring a slow and humiliating death. The thumbscrew rack. Similar to the thumbscrew, but more extreme. The thumbscrew rack was a larger device used on hands, feet, knees, or even heads. A victim's fingers, toes, or limbs were placed between two metal plates with spikes. The executioner tightened the screw, crushing bones and mangling flesh. It was often used to extract confessions. With each movement of the screw, the pain got even more intense. The lead sprinkler. The lead sprinkler was a small metal tool with a hollow bulb at the end. It was filled with molten lead, boiling oil, or even acid, then sprinkled onto the victim's skin, eyes, or inside open wounds. Damn. Sometimes, executioners forced victims to open their mouths, pouring the liquid down their throats, burning them from the inside. If molten lead was used, the flesh would cook instantly, and victims would often die from shock or suffocation. This is definitely just inhumane. Rat torture. A metal or clay container filled with live rats was placed on the victim's stomach. A fire was then lit on top, making the rats desperate to escape. With nowhere to go, they clawed and chewed through the victim's body, causing serious pain. The victim usually dies from deep wounds and infection. Impalement. This brutal execution was made famous by Vlad the Impaler. A long wooden stake was pushed through the victim's body, usually through the booty hole, underside, or belly. They were then lifted upright, and gravity slowly pulled them down, forcing the stake deeper inside. The stake was often left dull, so it wouldn't kill too quickly. Victims suffered extreme pain, bleeding, and infection, sometimes staying alive in agony for days before dying. The Spanish tickler. also called cat's paw. This was a metal claw-like tool used to rip flesh from the victim's body. The sharp, curved spikes could tear through skin, muscle, and even break bones. Victims were usually stripped naked and tied up, leaving them helpless as executioners raked the claw across their skin, peeling it off in strips. The pain was so unbearable, and many died from blood loss or infection. The Spanish donkey. This torture device consisted of a sharp wooden beam, shaped like a narrow triangle. The victim was forced to sit on top, with the sharp edge pressing directly into their lap. They sometimes tied weights to the victim's feet, increasing pressure, or rolled them back and forth, cutting deeper, and even worse, kept them in place for hours or days, leading to permanent damage. Judas cradle. The Judas cradle was a wooden pyramid with a sharp tip. The victim was stripped naked and lowered onto the pyramid, with the point inserted into their booty hole or underside. To increase the pain, they tied weights to the victim's legs, forcing them deeper onto the pyramid. They would then rock the victim back and forth, tearing flesh apart and oil, or fire, to burn the exposed wounds. The victims usually came from infection, blood loss, or sheer exhaustion from prolonged, agonizing pain. The garrote. This method uses the well-known strangulation, but with a device used to amp and make the process even more painful. It was done in Spain, Portugal, and Latin America, where the victim was seated against a wooden post and a metal collar was tightened around their neck using a screw. Some versions had a sharp spike, which pierced the spine, causing instant paralysis but leaving the person alive while they slowly suffocated. The choke pear. This one is done with a metal device shaped like a pear, inserted into a victim's mouth, throat, or rectum. And damn, that's just insane. It has a screw mechanism to expand the device, stretching and tearing the soft tissue. Witches and political prisoners were victims of this back in the day. But to make things worse, spikes were added to this device, which would puncture the person's insides when expanded, and that could cause torn muscles and ruptured tissue, leading to internal bleeding. It is definitely a slow and painful death. The breaking wheel. A brutal execution used in medieval Europe. The breaking wheel involved tying a victim's arms and legs to a large wooden wheel. The executioner then smashed their bones with an iron hammer, twisting the broken limbs through the spokes. Some victims were left on the wheel for days, slowly dying from shock or dehydration. The pain was unbearable, and since these executions were public, they also served as a gruesome warning to others. Tucker telephone. The device was a modified field telephone, designed to send powerful electric shocks through a prisoner's body, primarily targeting the genitals. A prisoner was restrained, often tied to a chair or held down, ensuring they could not escape. One electrical wire was attached to the prisoner's big toe, while another was connected to the genitals. A guard or prison doctor would then turn the crank on the field telephone, generating electricity that surged through the body, causing violent convulsions, muscle spasms, and in many cases, loss of bladder and bowel control. Execution by elephant. This one's pretty basic, as the name suggests. Elephants are left to crush the victims or impale prisoners. It was used in South and Southeast Asia and was mainly a public thing. Victims were mostly accused of treason or other major crimes, and in some extreme cases, the elephants were trained to make the execution as slow as possible, crushing non-vital parts until the very last minute. Saw torture. This was one of the most gruesome execution methods, often used in medieval Europe and Asia. The victim was hung upside down, usually naked, with their legs spread apart. This position forced blood to rush to the brain, keeping them conscious for as long as possible. A large two-man saw was then used to cut the victim in half, starting from the groin and moving downward, causing severe pain to the victim. In some cases, executioners would stop at the abdomen, ensuring the victim stayed alive to suffer as long as possible. The Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden was a terrifying execution device. It's a coffin-like chamber lined with sharp spikes. The victim was placed inside, and when the door slammed shut, the spikes would pierce the body, causing multiple deep wounds, causing extreme pain and slow bleeding. However, the spikes were strategically placed to avoid vital organs, ensuring that death was slow and painful rather than immediate. Some versions had spikes on hinges, allowing the torturer to increase pressure gradually, causing even greater agony. The Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull was a cruel execution device from ancient Greece. Made of hollow bronze, it was shaped like a bull and used to burn people alive. Victims were locked inside, and a fire was lit beneath, turning it into a deadly oven. Inside, pipes distorted their screams into deep, bull-like roars, making their agony sound like an enraged beast. Some say it was real, while others think it's a myth. Either way, it remains a chilling symbol of ancient cruelty. Boiling to death. This method is really intense, as it involves submerging the victim in boiling liquid, mostly water, oil, or even molten metal. And as you can tell, that's basically a death sentence. It was used in medieval Europe and parts of Asia as a punishment for murderers and traitors. Victims were either thrown into the boiling liquid immediately, causing instant burns and shock, or slowly lowered in, starting with the feet, prolonging the intense pain before they died. Scaphism. An ancient Persian execution, scaphism was one of the most horrifying torture methods in history. The victim was trapped between two wooden boats, with only their head, hands, and feet sticking out. They were force-fed milk and honey, leading to severe diarrhea, while their body was covered in honey to attract insects. Flies, maggots, and other bugs slowly ate away at their flesh, while infections from their own waste spread through their body. Death was slow and agonizing, sometimes lasting weeks, as the victim rotted alive. The head crusher. The head crusher was a brutal device used mainly for interrogation. The victim's chin was placed on a metal bar, and their head was positioned under a metal cap. A screw was slowly tightened, crushing the skull bit by bit. At first, teeth shattered and eyes popped out of their sockets. If the screw continued turning, the skull was completely crushed, leaving nothing but a bloody mess. Ling Chai, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, is a brutal Chinese execution method where the victim was tied to a wooden frame, and the executioner used a sharp knife to slowly cut away pieces of flesh over time. The first cuts were usually made to non-vital areas like arms, legs, or chest, causing extreme pain but keeping the victim alive. More than 100 cuts could be made before the executioner finally killed the victim by removing the heart or decapitating them. The Blood Eagle. A brutal Viking execution, the Blood Eagle was reserved for traitors and enemies. The victim was tied face down as the executioner sliced open their back, exposing the ribcage. One by one, the ribs were broken and pulled outward like wings. With the chest forced open, the lungs were dragged over the shoulders, leaving the victim to suffocate as their body went into shock. The pain was unimaginable, the process slow and deliberate, ensuring they remained conscious long enough to experience every moment of their suffering. Flaying, also known as skinning alive, one of history's most brutal punishments, flaying was practiced in ancient Assyria, China, and medieval Europe. Executioners used sharp knives to peel away the victim's skin, often starting at the face or feet to prolong suffering. Some were skinned inch by inch, their raw nerves exposed to unbearable pain. Others were flayed completely, left to die from shock, blood loss, or infection. Death was slow and agonizing, lasting minutes to hours as the body shut down from unbearable trauma.